Thanks so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry about the technology problems, but we'll skip over some of the presentations so we can make sure we've got lots of time for discussion. I think I was just beginning my talk with saying that I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat people, and I think all of us here today are joining from Indigenous lands. There's a lot more that we could say about the importance of truth and reconciliation, but I did want to open just by saying I've been working on issues related to diversity and inclusion for 30 years, starting with a focus on women in technology. And I find that I'm learning all the time. So this is one of those areas where you can have some expertise in a particular dimension based on either what you study or your lived experience. But it is a constantly evolving domain. And so really look forward to comments from the audience. Next slide, please. We're going to just talk about a few high-level things that come from the research that Tanya and I have been doing with many others across the country in collaboration with partners like Nadine and the Black Business Professional Association. And I wanted to frame the discussion with a little bit of context around innovation in the future of work, what we know about employment, particularly with youth, and some of the work that we've done in identifying projects and programs that are designed to bridge some of these gaps. And then we'll open it up to a conversation with Nadine and Tanya on some of the issues that are of particular importance to them. And then we'll have time for audience Q&A, and especially audience comments, suggestions, and so on. Next slide, please. So I always really frame my discussions around innovation and entrepreneurship with this idea of the ecosystem. There aren't simple solutions to complex problems. And when we think about how to drive an innovation and entrepreneurship agenda in Canada, in my mind, it's very important that we recognize that change is needed at multiple levels. We have to think about policy. We have to think about infrastructure, access to technology broadly. We have to think about culture and values and assumptions and stereotypes, and many other macro level trends. We have to also look at organizational policies and practices. What are we doing in universities when it comes to training and education? What are we doing in K to 12? Because that lays the foundation for then access to university and highly qualified personnel. What are we doing in our incubators and accelerators? And in particular, how are we providing access to financing and support? And a lot of the work that we've been doing lately really focuses our attention, for example, on practices in financial institutions and who has access to money and who does not. And then at the end of the day, we have to think about individual level issues. We have to think about skills and capacity, but we also have to think about attitudes. We have to think about how we treat each other, how we become allies in advancing diversity and inclusion, for example, and how we ensure that we are providing opportunities for others. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I think is really foundational, and it's something many of you have probably heard me speak about before if you've come to sessions, is that I would argue that one of our fundamental challenges in Canada is that we have often fallen into a definition of innovation which is very limited, which equates innovation with the creation of technology. And innovation isn't just about building new apps or infrastructure or tools and devices. Innovation is about doing things differently. And this can include new products and services. It can include new organizational forms and collaborations, and it can include new processes. And it's really important to me that we recognize that innovation is not making new technology. Innovation is about doing things differently. And COVID really, I think, emphasized this. You know, Shopify did not become Canada's largest company um, because of a whack of new IP that it launched during COVID. Shopify became Canada's largest company because people started adopting technology in different ways. People started using the Shopify platform. And, I always like to remind people that Kylie Jenner became a billionaire at the age of 20, not making new technology, but selling her stuff on Shopify. So it's very important that when we think about innovation, even when we think about technology, we recognize that adoption of technology is what drives innovation, not just making the technology. And if we think about vaccinations, it was really important to have the science to develop the vaccines. But if you don't get them into people's arms, you don't actually solve the problem of COVID. Next slide, please. And this is important in my mind because when we start thinking about skills, we have to avoid equating skills for innovation with STEM. And I think that that is one of the biggest blind spots that we have in Canada, where we associate innovation with particularly engineering and computer science. And it isn't that those disciplines aren't important, and it isn't that we don't need more people going into computer science and engineering. And in fact, I've been working on increasing representation of women in those disciplines for 30 years. And I am an abject failure because today there are fewer women in computer science and only marginally more in engineering than there were 30 years ago. But we have to recognize that those technology foundations are foundations. They're necessary, but they are not sufficient to drive innovation. Next slide, please. And also they have unintended consequences, because if you define innovation as science, technology, engineering, and math, you exclude women, you exclude Indigenous people, you exclude Black people, and you don't necessarily get the results you want. Next slide, please. The other thing that's important, and this carries through into our definition of entrepreneurs. When you say the word entrepreneur, people associate it with STEM. People associate it with Silicon Valley, with Elon Musk, and so on. They don't think about Kylie Jenner. They don't think about Celine Dion, who is actually one of the richest women in Canada because of her innovations, because of her businesses, because of her products and services. And so one of the fundamental things, if we're trying to create an inclusive innovation ecosystem, is to break this stranglehold that notions of entrepreneurship, that technology seems to have on notions of entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship takes many different forms. It's a critical driver of the Canadian economy. And if we only define it as technology, we miss opportunities to think about innovation in services, innovation in health and beauty, innovation in rural communities, and so on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. And similarly, when we think about future skills, there's a lot of attention being focused on skilling, upskilling, reskilling, all of those things, critically important. Spent my life teaching, digital skills. But we have to recognize that the skills ecosystem includes not just supply issues, but also demand issues. And I would argue that the skills mismatch is partly a function of needing to ensure that people have the appropriate skills, but it's also a function of employers often looking for skills in all the wrong places, in thinking that they have to hire in their own image, in not recognizing the opportunities to build on what people have, as opposed to focusing on what they don't have. Next slide, please. And so when we think about shifting to digital workplaces, we have to recognize that the issues are not just around ensuring people have digital skills, but also ensuring that they have the competencies to use technology effectively. Next slide, please. And and getting clarity around definitions and what skills are and what competencies are, and this is something Tanya will speak about more, is really fundamental. I just give you this small example. So when you talk to students about whether or not, and graduates, about their communication skills, more than 90% will say they have good writing skills and good oral communication skills. When you talk to employers, not so much. Why is that? Well, in my view, it's not because students are entitled or deluded. It's because students are defining communication, written communication, as being able to produce an essay or a report. An employer may be thinking about communications in terms of, being able to produce a blog post or a memo or a well-written email. So we have to really start to become more precise in how we understand skills. Next slide, please. And this is another example: digital skills, shortage of digital skills, need more digital skills, digital skills. OECD did a study of Ontario employers, and yes, they want more digital skills. However, when they are saying digital skills, only 10% of them are thinking about deep technology skills like full stack Java developers and so on. 15% of them are actually talking about skills need to be taught, but don't necessarily require a computer science degree. So using SAP or SQL, you can learn those fairly readily, regardless of your background. Technical support. Some people have to have deep technology skills and others not so much. But 75% of what Ontario employers mean when they say digital skills, Microsoft Office, spreadsheets, PowerPoints, etc., etc. So precision in this area is really important because some people hear digital skills. We need more computer scientists and engineers. And yes, of course we do. But what this tells us is we also need people who can use Excel. We also need people who can use Microsoft Office and other, typical tools in the workplace, accounting systems, and so on. Next slide, please. And similarly, the assumption, and this is really mean, but I have to say it as someone who did a master's degree in history before I went to the dark side and did my MBA and PhD in management science. What this shows you, in spite of the focus on STEM, that in fact, graduates in social sciences, at least in the province of Ontario, earn more than graduates in agriculture and biology. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, which has become something we talk about all the time, really conceals some significant differences. Engineers have really different job prospects than biology graduates. And at the top of the heap, of course, are physicians and vets and so on, who build on those science backgrounds. But a pure science undergraduate degree doesn't earn you any more than a social science degree, a degree in, political science or psychology. And that's important because in my mind, encouraging students to study what they love and then think about how you provide specialized training, work integrated learning, and so professional skills is actually a pathway to success as well. Next slide, please. And so the other thing, of course, that's foundational are what we call essential skills. And ESDC has recently come out with a slightly updated version of this. But essential skills really include what you would expect: reading, writing, arithmetic, digital skills, but also things like adaptability, collaborative skills, ability to work in groups, and leadership, and all of those other things that we know are increasingly important because they are transferable. If you have those as your foundation, you can move more easily from one domain to another. Next slide, please. And then we also need to think about entrepreneurial skills. And, in my mind, and I'm a bit biased because I'm a professor of entrepreneurship and strategy, but in my mind, entrepreneurial skills, and we have some evidence to really support this, entrepreneurial skills provide a solid foundation for driving change, for being adaptable, for working with nothing and creating something, whether or not you're going to run a small business, work in government, or in a large corporation. And it's really important in my mind to think about entrepreneurial skills increasingly as essential skills rather than skills that only Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and people who want to have in Silicon Valley need. The other thing I think is really important is that entrepreneurship training, in my view, offers an incredibly valuable way of providing experiential learning on a whole range of skills that are transferable. And by that, what I mean is when we look at what goes on in incubators, accelerators, and entrepreneurship training programs, some of the people, maybe 10%, will go on to be successful entrepreneurs. But it's also a really good way for people to learn project management, financial literacy, presentation skills, networking skills, and so on, that will stand them in good stead regardless of where they end up. And we think this is especially important in terms of creating pathways for non-traditional learners, creating pathways for newcomers. I work with the Syrian refugees, and now we're working with Afghan refugees. Some people come to Canada with 7 words of English, and they want to start a business. They want to do something. And so entrepreneurship training can actually provide an opportunity. Some kids can't sit still in traditional classrooms, but if you give them a project to solve, a problem to solve, or a business opportunity to start, suddenly they light up and they can perform in ways nobody expected. People with cognitive differences. Forbes says ADHD, entrepreneur superpower. Often the very same people who did not survive formal education excel as entrepreneurs because it's an environment that's more suited to the way that they see the world and function in their comfort zone. So thinking about entrepreneurship in this way, I think, opens up huge possibilities and is really critical for driving an innovation ecosystem. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there are issues around leadership, and COVID has certainly tested everybody's leadership skills and created a whole new orientation towards employee-centered leadership styles, to thinking about mental health as core, healthy workplaces as really core to success. And I would argue has also mainstreamed diversity and inclusion. Next, please. So skills we know are a principal driver of social mobility in Canada, but not everybody with the same skills has access to the same opportunities. And some of this has to do with these things that I've talked about, the lack of clear definitions, the fact that we devalue internationally educated professionals, and without question, bias and discrimination. And we'll talk more about how those are really creating problems in terms of what we're getting out of our innovation and skills ecosystem. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm going to go quickly through this because we stopped, but this is the classic one. Employers screaming for technology skills, and over 40% of internationally educated engineers are underemployed, and it's 49% for internationally educated women. And don't get me started talking about physicians and healthcare workers and so on. Next slide, please. Part of it's regulatory, but a lot of it is plain old discrimination. And we see the same thing when we look at outcomes for racialized persons in the workplace, whether they're born here or not. We no longer deny that racism is a problem in Canada. Next slide, please. This is one of the most horrifying pieces of research that I came across, because what it shows, look at the far right and look far left. Far right, university graduates with severe disabilities. Far left, high school dropouts without disabilities. High school dropouts without disabilities have better employment outcomes than university graduates with severe disabilities. Next slide, please. If you've made it through university, you can definitely perform a job. You know, here I just wanted to highlight Colin Druin's point from Pride at Canada, where he said he had early in his career the same wisdom for mentors. Hide who you are until you get promoted as high as you can, and they can't get rid of you without people noticing. There are a lot of people who live their lives, whether it's in school or the workplace, hiding who they are. We see this with Muslims as well. The other comment there is, you know, there was a man who worked on Bay Street who went out drinking with his buddies and told them he was a recovering alcoholic rather than divulging that he was Muslim. Next slide, please. So when we look at youth, the situation is worse. When we look post-COVID, the situation is worse because many of the existing inequalities were deepened. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And this comes out when we look at youth employment, and youth face more employment barriers. Racialized youth face even more. Next slide, please. And when we look at Black students, the situation, while it has marginally improved, is really quite grim. Twice as likely to drop out, half as likely to go to post-secondary. Half of them don't feel they belong in school. Streaming is still a huge problem across the country, although Ontario is de-streaming. Grade 9, I have one of my staff with a PhD in a quantitative area whose mother was told when he was in, you know, grade 8 that he should go into the vocational stream because he would struggle too much. So these are huge issues. And we also know that you end up with intersectionality as well, because 60% of the Black community are also immigrants, many are Muslims, and so on. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Racism is pervasive, and younger people see it more. People who are furthest from the workplace, more likely to be racialized. Next slide, please. And there's also deep associations of mental health impacts. This is hot off the press, just a study we're just releasing with Environics. Job losses among people under the age of 25, more severe. Dropout of post-secondary and high school because of COVID, more severe for young people, obviously. But if people are Indigenous or Black, the rates are even higher. So we had problems before COVID, and those problems have been exacerbated. Next slide, please. And we're going to talk more about strategies for dealing with some of these issues. So I think at this stage, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll open up to my panelists to talk more about their perspectives, their experiences, and what we need to do to bridge some of these gaps. Thank you so much. So again, apologies for that slow start, but we still have a good chunk of time to dig in on some of these issues in more detail. What I'd like to do is start with giving each of both Nadine and Tanya an opportunity to just set a bit of context in terms of their experience, where they're coming from, their perspectives on some of these issues, and then we'll work through some more detailed questions. So Nadine, I'll start with you. I mean, you have experience as an entrepreneur, as a Black woman and as the leader of the largest Black business organization in the country, as well as someone who's played a pivotal role in creating the new Black entrepreneurship strategy that the government is now championing. So I just wonder if you can spend a few minutes and give us your perspective on these issues, both as an individual as well as a leader in this space.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Wendy, and good morning, everyone. Wendy, as I listen to your presentation, I'm just like nodding my head up and down in with the research and the points that you've made. Because when I think about Black entrepreneurs, even myself, and I'll share a little bit about my story just as background, I think that we have to create spaces where individuals who don't fall into the normal status quo, white male perspective, that there's solutions for them. So right now I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, which is the Treaty 6 territory within the Métis homelands. And it's interesting because it's my entrepreneurial journey that has brought me here. When I was in high school, I never did well in geography because I'm an experiential learner, and context lets me understand. And I've been an entrepreneur from the age of 12, and my entrepreneurial background started with my mother, who's then a new immigrant, moved to Canada, left me in Jamaica with her friend who did not do the best job at taking care of me. And she would send me on these errands into town to buy these cakes. And I didn't have enough money to feed myself or enough money to get back home. And when I went to the marketplace for the first time, I walked around and I sought the opportunity. And I bought cakes from one woman, 10 cakes for the price of 8. I went to another place in the marketplace, packaged it up very nicely, and I sold it. And the moment the coins hit my hand, I became a businesswoman. And I didn't know it then, but I became an entrepreneur. And so I champion entrepreneurship for the constituents that I serve, which are Black people that look like me, because it's a way out and it's an avenue. And when we apply all the things for entrepreneurial success, we're then able to make a good go of it. However, the challenges that we have and the challenge that I see for entrepreneurs are systemic challenges. Like when we walk into a bank, someone sees the color of our skin and we don't get the loan. We don't have access to the network. We don't have access to the capital that we need. And so those are some of the big challenges that we face. And this conversation is an important one. And when I look at our youth programs for Black youth entrepreneurs, again, for them, the challenges are broad and wide, and it starts from education. Because, when you talked about streaming, when we're streaming Black unracialized youth into different programs, we're really shutting the door for bigger opportunities for them. And entrepreneurship is one avenue amongst many, with different individuals who learn in a different way. If we close the door, like, not everyone's going to be a doctor and not everyone's going to be a scientist, and so we have to have different streams and different opportunities open for Black youth to see. And also, as we build into entrepreneurship and we create programs, it's really important to look at entrepreneurship from a cultural perspective, looking at where the gaps are, looking at what happened in corporate Canada, why Black professionals self-select out of the corporate environment and start their own businesses. They do that because of systemic barriers within corporate culture, and then of course within our businesses we see that same systemic challenge as well. And then this is why we need the programs. This is why we need the training and the resources. And frankly, this is really why conversations like this matters, because it opens doors. It opens doors in two ways. One, because the broader mainstream society sees the real challenges. And with that, we're able to find solutions to the challenges that entrepreneurs face.
Sharing that. We'll come back to some of the ecosystem issues as well that you raised, access to financing. And Nadine, as you and I have both discovered, it doesn't just apply to access to financing for entrepreneurs, but it has a profound impact on access to financing for mortgages, for example. And one of the studies we recently did with the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board looking at racism within the real estate industry, most of the real estate agents identified the financial institutions as the principal barriers for racialized people in home ownership, and that just reinforces the problems around some of the systemic um, biases that get built into the very mechanisms that are used to give people access to money. Turn it to you, Tanya, for a moment to just give kind of an overview of the different aspects of this that you've been working on and looking at through your future skills work, through your WEC work, but also through the work that you've done in it specifically in Quebec.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Wendy. Well, hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here and share this session with my partners, Wendy and Nadine. So, Wendy, I've been working, as you know, on generational values for years, working on future skills development and gaps in training and looking at the changing work, especially in the organization of the working systems, such as remote work that we are experiencing now, and all what's changing in this employment relations. So, recent years, we have seen this shift in industry, 4.0 industry and work. And since the pandemic, the world of work really has been undergoing some major changes. And as we were looking together into more SMEs and entrepreneurship, we know that they are running through a greater burden with lack of infrastructure as well as resources to keep the same pace of all the changing processes. So what I have been looking at more specifically is, first, what are these cross-functional skills we need to measure skills in order to understand where the gaps are. And this was a major issue for the last few years because we have had some category typologies, etc., which is not always working. And as you were saying in your introduction remarks, is that we put some emphasis on digital skills, where again, when we ask employers, we know that soft skills as important and cognitive skills are as important, and even social skills, communication skills are as important. What I've been looking also at is the work systems, how they are changing, because you have to relate skills to something. You have to understand how the organizational design is being affected by technology so that you can anticipate the skills that are needed. And again, we sometimes look at skills, but we forget to see how the organizational design is changing. And the changes that are put forward are very much in line with the values shift that we are seeing, like appropriation of time, like better quality of life, etc. And again, with what we have heard at the COP26 and all that had to do with the financial markets looking at more humane objectives and environment, social, and governance impact. I have been also looking at the differences in skill development between from a diversity lens again, and our session is on advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And when you are looking at skills gaps, we need to look at how on the market, on the labor market, how different people from different groups are reacting, whether they are older or younger, according to gender, according to race, according to ethnicity. Again, you talked about people with disabilities, indigenous workers as well. So we have to look at the whole market and see what's happening in terms of development of skills. And the fact that you see people in different types of jobs and sectors also give them sometimes less opportunity to be ahead in terms of skills and to be able again to have the same pace or be at the core or at the center of some of these changes and be able to have better quality conditions, working conditions. And I looked at also, and I hope that we will touch on this as well, some of the new strategies and actions and means in terms of training and developing these skills. Because again, we cannot apply traditional strategies to all these changes that are happening. And center to all this is what you have stated at the beginning again of this the panel, is the ecosystem, and the changes have to be made in a much more experimental way than they have been done before, because the problem is we do not know where we're going. Sometimes the technology is going so fast is that we cannot anticipate that well what is going to happen. So we need to look at things differently, and we need a set of skills to be able to look at things differently.
A couple of things that really I want to underscore, which is it's really hard to plan when you can't predict. And I think we demonstrated that pretty quickly. When before COVID, we were all citing Osborne and Frye. Well, I wasn't, but other people were citing this sort of echo chamber of Osborne and Frye. 42% of jobs will disappear by, I think it was this year. And then people would take that projection and they say, oh, okay, so if 42% of jobs are going to disappear, then that must mean we have to do this and we have to do that. Well, Osborne and Frye said something very different. They said, if you do the analysis of the jobs, up to 42% could be automated. They didn't say they would be automated. And in fact, while people were waiting for robots to come eat our jobs, nobody was looking at for COVID. Very few people were anticipating what a pandemic might do. And we've actually come out of the pandemic with another labor shortage as well as a skill shortage. So our ability to actually predict even 5 years ahead is really not very good. And that's why I do think, Tanya, your point about flexibility, resilience, obviously, we don't ignore the trends that we see, but thinking that we can accurately predict how many of these people or how many of those people we're gonna need is a bit of a mug's game. And the other thing that I had forgot to say earlier, which is really important, is often we take projections based on the US. We look at what's going on there, we look at the models, we look at the solutions. US economy in the private sector is dominated by large corporations, right? It's at least 50% are large corporations, over 500 employees. In Canada, 90% of private sector employment is in SMEs. The SME capacity to do some of the large scale automation that we see in large corporations in the States is simply not there. So the patterns, the trajectories, the kinds of technologies and the forms they're going to take, very, very different. And it also really, really underscores Nadine's point about how entrepreneurship is critically important. And we hear that all the time in Canada, but it is fundamental to the structure of our economy. I'll come back now to you, Nadine, and just get you to talk a little bit more about what you see specifically in the Black community with respect to entrepreneurship, and especially Black youth. Where are the real challenges, and what's the impact of COVID been?
I think the real challenges for Black youth is the lack of resources available to them in the space. I think, and the number one thing is the lack of what they see. You can't be it if you can't if you can't see it, and we don't have enough individuals that they can see and aspire to. And then when we look at, again, just systemic, racism, which has prevented Black professionals and entrepreneurs from leveraging their skills and talents and to create wealth, there's less capital an opportunity for Black entrepreneurs, and so what does that mean for Black youth? There's not enough funnel down to them, and not only that, the lack of awareness in terms of we don't understand financial literacy, we don't understand business literacy, and without that lack of understanding, how then do we then build a viable sustainable business. It's just not possible. And so while we continue to build programs, it's the awareness as well. The awareness is also missing for Black youth, because we imagine that everyone has access to technology the way we all do today, but that digital divide is very, very real in terms of access, and this particular sector getting access to the resources, the technology, the tools they need to even participate in the programs, to participate in the mentorship and the other areas that's needed to help. So those are some of the gaps that we're seeing with our Black youth. We had one entrepreneur who came up with a brilliant idea to measure, so you could be at home and have your size. I think it's called sizeogram. So you put your size into this tool, and when it's interfaced with the stores, you get the perfect item, so you don't have to ship it back. But the challenge for this entrepreneur, he needs money to scale up. He needs to be into the right group that can help him launch his product, and that's just not available at that level. So those are some of the things that we're seeing.
Well, and I know that that you did some really important research, which compared the impact of COVID on your membership to the impact of COVID on the Canadian Federation of Independent Business membership. And what it showed was COVID had hit Black entrepreneurs and businesses twice as hard, twice as likely to have lost sales, twice as likely to be at risk of going out of business, and so on and so forth, but half as likely to be able to get access to government funding. And you and I have talked a lot about this. There's been a lot of press around access to financing specifically, and you mentioned that financial literacy is a piece of it. But can you talk us through a little bit more about how access to financing is both a barrier, but what the mechanics of that are? Like, what is it that Black entrepreneurs or just Black people generally experience when they go for financing? Because I know you've got some good examples.
Oh yes. So I'm in Edmonton, and we're here with the launch of our BADES program, Business Advisory Implementation Development Program. And so we had 50 Black businesses last night at an information session, and two of the Black business owners commented that while the banks have this entrepreneurship program, when they went online, they saw that the entrepreneurship programs listed, but when they actually called the bank, no one knew about this Black entrepreneurship program. They were pushed into other areas. So that again is a challenge, because here we are, there is this we're creating opportunities for Black entrepreneurs, but actually when we get there, no one knows. No one has the training to say, hey, Mr. So and so, this is what's available for you. I think one of my best stories and example is one of our members who's a businesswoman. Her company, she's grown her company to 10 million, and we're working with her to scale that up to about 25 million. But she shares how she mortgaged her home 9 times. 9 times she borrowed funds from a loan shark at 25% to grow her business, because she was relentless and wouldn't stop. Now she was able to grow her business now to she's doing $9 million a year. And I can't help but imagine what it would have been like for her, and how easier it would have been for her if she was able to get access to funding. Not only that, her employability of employing people in her company. And a lot of the times it is Black business owners that give Black youth the opportunity to work in our companies. So it's really important that Black entrepreneurs succeed, because we are the ones that's going to take that first chance on another Black person to hire them. And so these are some of the things that we've seen. And Wendy, as you and I talk about all the time, is that there has to be an intentional look, an intentional approach to how we address these challenges, because they are very real, and they're not being addressed enough. And going back to that survey that we did when COVID just started, most of the businesses that we surveyed didn't have access to any cash flow at all to take them through not even a month, versus other mainstream organizations that had between 6 months to 24 months cash reserves in their banks. And a lot of the businesses that we dealt with, they weren't called. A lot of the mainstream businesses, the banks call them, will you take the CEBA loan? Will you take the CEBA loan? I had one white entrepreneur said that He didn't need the money, and they kept calling him incessantly until he took the money just to get them off his back. But the Black entrepreneurs that we surveyed did not have that experience.
And I remember one of the things that really struck me was, I think the number was 48% of CFIB members said they could not take on additional debt. 96% of the Black entrepreneurs said they couldn't take it on. The other thing we've talked about is the structure of financing. We know that in Canada, we read all the time about, the government has decided to put $50 million into, the latest quantum computing startup, or I just saw recently the province of Ontario announced $5 million for women and racialized and Indigenous entrepreneurs, and the same day they announced $24 million for the Perimeter Institute. It's not that I've got anything against the Perimeter Institute, but there are some issues of scale there. We know that most businesses in Canada start with $5,000. How, and we know from global research that microfinancing, microgrants, and so on have a profound impact. Bangladesh and many emerging economies have great success stories on how giving small amounts of money to grassroots entrepreneurs can really drive economic development. Can you talk a little bit about, what you observe in terms of the ability, for example, of Black women to get that small amounts of financing they need to start their businesses? And youth are among them, of course.
Yeah. Well, when you say 5,000, and I think, oh, that's even still a lot for many of the Black entrepreneurs, and especially the women. Wendy, the reality is that with our Boss Women Entrepreneurship Training Program, we have about 150 Black women that show up every week to get training on how to win in business. And what we've seen is that many of them start with $1,000. So I know while some establishments don't really champion the microfinance model, it does work. It helps Black women entrepreneurs specifically, because it's a start. It's a start to understand credit, financial literacy, and how the importance of financing is to your business. And so we start with $1,000 or the $5,000, and then we continue to build and turn that and grow. And then we get the training as we're on the path, and looking at the bigger loans. But the scalability piece is important. And that's why the financial literacy is so important. When we look at, you start with $5,000 and then you build your business, but then you get to a point where you need a reserve. We don't have that reserve. We don't have the cash flow. And what does the cash flow mean? And, how do we then collect the receivables and all of those things that impede businesses? Those are some of the things, we continue to build and work on for women. And what I ask for, not just government financial institutions, is to really look at what that model looks like. One of our colleagues, Ejibola, she talked about an example where, the banks will give you $300 if you open an account, but you can take the $300 and you can leave and shut the account down. So they're putting that investment in and that risk of giving you the $300. Why don't we start with, a $1,000 business credit line, so we can understand, how to manage that, and we can use that to start our business, and having that traction and that understanding. So those are some of the things, we really have to consider, because it's shown and it's proven. And that's why the microfinance model has been so successful, is that, we are worth the risk. We're not going to default on these loans, and it gives us an opportunity to build and grow into scalable businesses.
Yeah. And the reality is right now it's easier to get microfinancing in Bangladesh than it is in Canada, because so many of the programs are designed for businesses that are more established to help them scale, of course, important. But there's a real gap at this early stage. I'm going to turn to you, Tanya, a bit, because I know you've done some work with organizations like FEMASUR and RFAQ that in terms of their experiences with smaller loans, smaller grants, access to markets, and so on. Are there lessons there that we can draw on when we're thinking about what youth need in the early stages of their their entrepreneurship journey or careers.
What I can say is what we got through the surveys that I have done with them. And again, in line with what Nadine and you have been saying, when we ask women, and especially women from underrepresented group, and even younger women that are, launching their own projects and entrepreneurship endeavor, are usually using some savings and less going to banks, and again less going to incubators to help them maybe get their project and get into the banks. And then you see like a vicious circle happening there, is that more educated women who have already knowledge in terms of running businesses, etc., have easier access to banks. And so it's like, it's like a never ending circle. So, and this is where some agencies, some institutions like Famisor and Réseau des Femmes d'Affaires du Québec are trying to get some strategies that are aiming at underrepresented groups, for women, and looking at all the barriers and what's happening, that the systemic discrimination that can happen and is already embedded in even their own system, on how they evaluate some of the projects, etc., which get funding or not. Something else that's interesting is with the Réseau des Femmes d'Affaires du Québec is putting some also emphasis on procurement and getting the business also for women. So it's not only about financing, it's about getting them the business so that they're not always in the need. And this is also very clear when you look at the networks that they need. And I think that whether they are trying to just, make their strategies better adapted, and to do so, it's not just a question of attraction. I think you go back to the same principle that you apply EDI in organization when you do these programs, and all you care about is attracting. So this is good. It's just the startup point, and then you need to look at the whole, the trajectory of the entrepreneurship and see all the barriers, whether it's in financing, whether it's getting the support, whether it's getting into the networks, exporting, procurement, etc. And I think now with all the studies that have been done, I think there is, and the impact also that being asked from governments, I think that this is where the new, like the shifts are lying ahead. I think that the fact that we are looking at different impacts, and not only from the economic point of view and, from how much money you're making at the end, but looking also at the social impact, community impact, reinforcing capacities impact, quality of life impact, governance, how much, and these are new set of KPIs that I think would make it happen and would encourage, all institutions to look in a different way, so that they not only attract and help youth, women, underrepresented group, but get it done. And and this is where we can see that the strategies are not coming from different ways. So you have legal issue, but you have as well, the financial markets that are looking at these new impacts, government who are giving money, whether they are federal, provincial, municipal, etc. They are looking at these impacts, they want to measure them, and we see even all the research shifting towards these new ways of looking at key performance indicators, the KPIs.
Yeah, it's really good point. Coming back to that, I said at the beginning that one of our challenges is a very narrow lens on what is innovation, what is entrepreneurship. And so historically, you've seen huge, and I was Vice President of Research and Innovation, huge focus on IP, or on commercialization of IP. All that's important, but it's not enough. Huge focus on high growth, high growth, high growth, high growth. And what we know is with a lot of Indigenous organizations in particular, but also in the Black community, focus isn't necessarily on growth. It may just be on sustainability. It may just be on creating a business that will provide jobs and a good life for a small group of people in a community. But that's an important point as well. And similarly, as you say, Tanya, we say that we're committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. We say we're committed to the green economy. But, you know, if Vicki Saunders were here from SheEO, she would say those things are not valued when businesses are being assessed. Typically, it's a very traditional set of metrics for which apply to a relatively small group of companies when it comes to attracting financing. And I think the other thing that's so important is you really made it clear that financial capital is one thing. Sales, also very important. We shouldn't just be focusing on attracting investment. We should be focused on internally generated resources and recognizing that the financial capital that businesses need are matched by their human capital needs, the training, the knowledge, the skills that you've both talked about, as well as the social capital, the networks, the mentoring, and those broader supports. And I think, Tanya, the point that you made, and maybe you can elaborate on this, that when you look at men versus women, women are more interested in skills and training development than they are incubators and accelerators, does also suggest either incubators and accelerators are not meeting the needs of women, or they're not welcoming, or women need something different. Can you maybe talk about that and how you see there's a lot of emphasis focused on investing in incubators and accelerators to grow the innovation economy? Where do you see them fitting in relative to some of these other things that entrepreneurs, and especially young entrepreneurs, need?
Yeah, well, definitely. This is a really very important point, Wendy, because if we look at the ecosystem more in Quebec, and we have through Réseau Mentorat, the Institut de la Banque Nationale, HEC Montréal, they have the indicators, the index that they use to see how entrepreneurship is evolving. And what we can see is there's great potential, whether is it with immigrant entrepreneurs, whether is it with younger entrepreneurs, where really the desirability to go into entrepreneurship is really great and hitting, sometimes 20-25% of intention, to go into entrepreneurship and start their own business. When you look at what's happening, the percentages go back to 4%, 5%, 6%. So there's something there's something wrong in this thing. Either the publicity around entrepreneurship is great and everyone wants to try and go and be an entrepreneur, and then when they start doing this, then it's not happening for them. So either they're not getting the finances, or they're not having the right support, or the right knowledge to go into this, or they are getting discouraged at a certain point. So I think this is where incubators, accelerator can play really a very important role. And from some of the data that we had and I was analyzing around incubators, you could see that women would go into incubators when they have their project already set, whether they are in manufacturing and like they need the big bucks to go into something, but they have like all the project set up for them, and they would spend much more time training than going into incubators and putting and starting their project. And the differences are double between men and women, and they even go into incubators when they already have a prospect of getting the money. It's like they are just at the end of making the project very solid, presentable, etc. So, and if you look at, again, technology, they are almost not there, or if they are there, they are very much into certain type of technology development, etc. So again, incubators have to look at the system using discrimination, the diversity lens, and see how come they're not attracting more and what's not happening in the way that they are doing things. And I think, again, there is the discourse out there, but how to get into this? Well, you have to look at the principles around EDI, attract, but bring the system to the people and not to the underrepresented groups, and not the underrepresented group to the system, which is not really working very well as far as we can see, as far as the statistics would say.
Interesting, because Ryerson has a network of incubators and accelerators at the university that are intended to be broad. So there's social, there's fashion, there's a whole variety of dimensions to try to get out, even though it started with tech, to try to attract a broader range of young people. Because as we said at the outset, entrepreneurship isn't just about tech, it's about a lot of other things. What about, from your perspective, Nadine, what about, apart from financing, can you talk more about the kinds of supports that you think young Black entrepreneurs need? What have they got now, and what more do they need in order to be successful?
Yeah, well, I wanted just to comment on Tanya's point that we have to bring the system to the entrepreneurs, because we imagine that they're all going to rush to the programs and rush to the different incubators and so forth. But especially for Black entrepreneurs, we're pedaling as fast as we can. The train is going and we're laying the track as the train is coming. And so what does that mean? We have to figure out how to bring those resources to the entrepreneurs, as we're doing at Boss Women. Like, they eat their dinner and they're doing the business plans as we're doing the program. So when we think about, to your question, Wendy, about Black youth and in entrepreneurs, what do they need? I think the number one thing we have to think about in programming and even in education is come from a strength-based approach instead of a deficit-based approach. When we build the programs, instead of it being from the negative perspective of what's lacking, how can we build it from a strength perspective of the possibilities and having them step into that, not seeing the our Black youth as all the challenges that we hear about. How can we step into something that's positive? Because then we're creating an environment that we can strive to be. And that's why, the See It, Be It is so important, because when we bring speakers in that they can aspire to, that looks like them, it's part of a trajectory that they can follow. They can follow on and follow to. So I think that's one of the key things. So when I think about the programs, we have, our the Youth Entrepreneurial Development Program at the BBPA. We give scholarships each year. And while we give scholarships, we recognize that the entrepreneurial part of the scholarship program is a critical one, because, for some reason, 50%, and I say that cheekily, not for some reason. We know the reasons, but 50% of Black youth who goes on to post-secondary studies do not graduate. And that's another conversation. However, when they leave university or post-secondary studies, they fall into the entrepreneurial space. So then how do we prepare for them? What is it that we have to offer them? And, how can we possibly build that they will go back to post-secondary studies? And so our scholarship program works with entrepreneurs one-on-one as young entrepreneurs. And with the program BASEL, Black African Caribbean Leadership Training Program, we have a sector of young Black entrepreneurs that for the first time they're thinking of a business. And we're starting with, of course, the data. What does it look like at phase one, and then in the middle, and then in the third phase? So the beginning, the middle, and then the post. So we can really have an understanding of where we're starting. What are the programs that's needed? What are the skills development, the training that's needed in the middle, and then looking at the outcomes at the end. And the outcomes of the end, what are the tangible successes that will really count for a future business for them? So things like being registered, their business plans being done, their financial starting of the understanding of that financial statement. One of the questions we get asked is, okay, so we have the plan, and then what? we don't know what to do after that. So then that's where the coaching and the mentorship comes in. So those are some of the programs that we're doing with our Black entrepreneurs. And we have automated the process, really getting us into using and becoming friendly with technology. And so we have the mentorship program that's automated as well, so we can check in with the entrepreneurs on a bi-weekly basis, just to see how things are going and giving that additional supports.
Great, thanks a lot. I wanted to, so far I'm monitoring the discussion forum, and I haven't seen a lot of comments, although Catherine from my team has been posting furiously a range of resources. I wonder if I can just again encourage the audience to post comments and to ask questions, because we do have a few minutes left. I can keep going through my questions, but I do want to encourage you to offer comments or questions if you have them through the discussion forum as we go forward. So back to you for a moment, and Nadine, just on the issues of what people need, it still is so striking to me. When we worked with, we were working with the Bank of Montreal on one of their competitions for women, and 1,000 women applied. 1,000 women from across Canada applied for the chance of getting one of 10 $10,000 projects, grants. It boggled my mind, given the money that's in the ecosystem. You had 1,000 women from across Canada applying for $100,000 divided by 10. And then you and your colleagues launched the Rise Up competition for Black women, $80,000, 8 times $10,000 grants. And the Black population in Canada is about 4%, I think, overall, 7% in Toronto. So 1,000 women across Canada applied for BMO. 700 Black women applied for the Rise Up competition for a chance to get $10,000. That to me just spoke volumes, especially when you see, how money gets handed out into whom across the ecosystem. But it really spoke volumes to me in how women generally don't have access to funding, and where Black women even more so don't have access to funding. But then there are all these other dimensions that you mentioned as well. I'm still
Yeah,
looking.
I
Sorry, go
just
ahead.
wanted to, yeah, I just want to comment that, it speaks to the study that we did, where, the impact women, and then we drill down further to Black women, and it shows that, disproportionately Black women were much more impacted. And, we would have had 1,200 actually. But, we had so many late submissions, we really had to stick to time. And, it was really heartbreaking when the women called, and it was 2 minutes after the deadline and 1 hour after the deadline, and they said, listen, we couldn't make the deadline because I'm managing the job and I'm managing the childcare at the same time. These are the challenges that we have, so we couldn't get the application in on time. But we are starting another Rise Up pitch competition for Black women across the country, and I know that we will have a lot more. And one of the some of the things that the women talked about was that they had an opportunity to not just get the money. And for the ones who didn't get the money, they said, we now understand business literacy. One of the women that called, she said, for the first time in my business that's been going for 5 years, I understand what business literacy is. And so those are the successes that that we're able to achieve based on these programs. And so we look forward to the next Rise Up Pitch competition, which I know there will be a lot more women. And of course, one of the things that I want to work on for the organization is how can we continue to build the supports? We need more resources for that. One of the things that the data showed is that the women needed access to network, we needed mentorship, we needed coach. So how can we make that possible? Because a win for any unrepresented group in our society is a win for the broader society at large. Because when you talk about innovation, and I think through all the successes we've had in different areas of innovation, not necessarily, the traditional innovation, but those nuanced ways that comes from our BIPOC communities, that comes from the women, are really quite profound. And I think these are what we have to champion and support.
I think, it's really a good point. And, there were two things I remember looking at some of the results, two things that really struck me. One was um, a lot of Black entrepreneurs come to, as you mentioned, they feel excluded from the workplace or they don't have opportunities, so they move into entrepreneurship. But equally, a lot of them said, I saw an opportunity. There's no shampoo for me. There was no soap for me. I love this kind of hot sauce. But there were also areas where people were introducing new products and services because their experience led them to know that there was a huge market that was not being served. And I think that's one of the things people forget, that as markets become more diverse in Canada, we need products and services that are equally diverse. And that's why even companies like Starbucks and Walmart and so on are starting to look at diversity programs to support Black, Indigenous, and other groups, not just because it's good social, CSR, but because they know those products will sell because the markets are becoming more diverse. And similarly, we saw those examples during COVID. You remember, Nadine, where someone was selling, maybe serving 6 local stores. And with COVID, they went online and suddenly they were hitting 60 supermarkets in the United States. And the opportunities to export, especially, we know Indigenous entrepreneurs, for example, export way more than the average Canadian entrepreneurs. We know newcomer entrepreneurs export way more than Canadian-born entrepreneurs. All of those things are also opportunities that I feel we're missing by not addressing these issues in a serious way. And I'm just noting that in the chat, Aspie wanted to know more about your observation, Tanya, that women seem to wait later before they go into incubators. And, I wondered if that has to do with what we know, the confidence gap, right? Is women have to have 100% of everything before they will put their name in a hat. Do you think we see something like that going on in that space, or how do you account for the decisions not to try for incubators early on in their
Well,
process?
well, definitely it's a question of confidence, but I would say that there is like a lack of this natural attraction towards incubator. Well, I'm not sure how much they feel, you know, I wouldn't say welcome. I'm sure at a certain point they would be welcome, but the thing is that they don't feel that this is the place for them to start, and they like need some, basic knowledge and the projects to start. And what we have seen also in the same survey is that like men would go back to incubators even for upscaling, and they're like it's a natural way of getting their business upscaled. They're looking at new projects, etc., where women need more assurance, probably because there's a lack of model. Again, like the See It Be It campaign was there for it. Probably they look at the sectors that are being covered by the incubators and they see that they have no place, or they see the who is there, the models that are emerging out of the incubators. So this is where you have to put some efforts into attracting, but again, making sure that the system is following and that they get what they need, and not only this is the way that we do things here and so you follow the program. It's what do I need and how can the program really follow also my needs. So I think this is where we need to work. And again, if we look at startups and if we look at some of incubators, technology incubators, even some of these problems are even more acute, more exacerbated in these places.
I think we can take a couple of extra minutes because we did start late. But you remind me of and Nadine, you and I have talked about this, the fact that when we're looking at Indigenous women and multi-generational trauma, when we're looking at refugee and immigrant youth and the impact of often conflict and uh, and trauma, when we're looking at the impact of anti-Black racism, which we know causes psychological damage, but also physical damage. And then you add those things together, because you have Black, immigrant, Muslim entrepreneurs who are facing these barriers on multiple levels. Can you talk a little bit about how we need to think about trauma and trauma-informed approaches, and how that comes into play in the approach that you're taking to supporting Black entrepreneurs?
It's one of the first things we have to consider, because when we talk about that confidence gap, that historical trauma informed piece plays a big part of that confidence gap. A lot of Black entrepreneurs don't go to apply for loans, because we have all that historical, we're not going to get it's the things we've learned from our parents as well. It's the things we learned from our parents. And that's why when we build our programming, we really come at it from a cultural perspective. We were at a meeting with a partner, and they said, why are there all these supports for Black entrepreneurs? When my people came, we came with $10 in our pockets. And so our response is, well, when we came, we were taken from some place, we came naked, and we were enslaved, and we worked for free. And so what does that do to your psyche? What does that do to your psyche over hundreds of years? And so that's one of the first things we have to reconcile as a community. And I think, how does that work together with the mainstream and different equity seeking communities? My daughter, who's a brilliant woman, she says, society wants the equity seeking groups to come up with a solution, but we didn't cause the problem. The problem didn't start with us. We so can we turn that? And so we have to come from a place of understanding, a place of equity, and I say collectively we, corporate Canada, governments, everybody, and really understanding that, when a loan application is filled out, or we go to apply for the programs, or we show up, what does that mean? And what are we bringing that historical generational trauma that we're bringing, and starting there, and having the training for our frontline supports, that lets you know that when a person of color walks into the bank to say, I want a loan, that there's a lot that comes with that, and really understanding. And you know what, maybe that the loan is not, we're not ready for the loan, but it's how you handle that response. And so I think that's a broader societal challenge that we all have to work on together.
Yeah, no, and I remember being very struck by how little I understood about this when I realized that some of the people coming to the Boss Women program, for example, didn't come just once or just twice. They had come 3 times. And I remember having that conversation with you, like, 3 times. Why are they taking, and every time the program's different and it's better and it's different speakers. But I'm
5
saying,
cohorts.
but I'm like, why are they coming over and over? And I remember you explaining that a lot of it was just developing their comfort, and their confidence was as important as the content. And that's one of the things that I think we're starting to really learn when we think about the skills agenda. I was on a call yesterday, and people are saying, it's information, computers can do it, adaptive learning, AI, and all that stuff. What I've come to realize is, in these processes, money is important, and the human capital and social capital are important, but a huge amount of this is social. It's intangible. It's psychological. It's getting you into the headspace where you believe you can do it, where you have the resilience. So when someone says no, you hear it as not just yet, and you come back and you come back and you come back. And that requires a certain kind of grit that ironically we see refugees, immigrants, Black people, Indigenous people have to even survive. And so I think there's just such an amazing opportunity to harness that talent if we can figure out how to do it in a way, as you said, Nadine, that is culturally appropriate. I think we've answered the questions. Some very good comments in chat. I'll just give you each a moment to sum up if there are any other points that you wanted to raise before we conclude the session. Starting with you, Tanya, any last comments about skills and what we need to do to build an inclusive innovation ecosystem?
Well, I would say that we're certainly not there, but we're getting there. We're probably in a good place. We're probably at a stage where we can change things. Why? Because we see government strategies aligned with ambitions, aligned with the financial markets, aligned with the discourse. So, like, these multiple strategies to get things moving and changing, more equity, looking at, again, quality of life, looking at different measures, looking at through this pandemic, we could see all the inequalities on the market. We could see the sectors that, had very difficult times. We could see also jobs lost for, certain groups more than others. So I think that we have seen a lot. The diagnosis that we can make is make things more, clearer, so that there can be some serious interventions. So I think now it's up to, again, the systems, the ecosystems, researchers, individual organizations, support communities, just to make a difference and keep on the pressure. I think that this is very important, because we see that things are not going to change by themselves. Demographics did not make anything change within organizations or within systems. So the pressure has to come from somewhere so that things change. And I think that we have some alignment between government strategies, between actions, between where we want to get to. And again, maybe a different generation that's, now in the workplace. And I'm not at all an advocate of, different values, but what I would say that some values are getting more and more confirmed with the new generation, like looking more like stimulation, like looking at things differently, like looking at things from different perspectives and making things happen. So this has started with baby boomers. It's not like it was not out there, but I think that it's going a step forward with this generation. And again, because we have no choice. So maybe all of these things would make things happen at a certain point. And I hope so. I would like to finish on a positive note anyway.
Thanks. And last word to you, Nadine.
Yeah, just that, providing services now that prevents social problems is an investment. I just a few things from this topic: innovation, looking at innovation in other ways, and looking at processes, and I think most importantly, recognizing the unique, nuanced needs of our diverse communities and our different sectors, entrepreneurs, youth, and meeting those needs, really understanding and operating from their perspective, not painting everyone with this one same brush, and recognizing the strength that does come from a diverse sector in our society. That's it.
Thanks so much. And thanks to all of you in the audience who participated and for your great comments. Lots of things.
Yes, sure. Thank you for everyone who participated. Lots of great comments to this very important discussion. I encourage you to look at the resources that's shared. You can certainly connect with Tanya, myself, and Wendy for more information if you ever need it. And we look forward to collectively building, growing, and strengthening our community and society together. Thank you. Merci.